Welcome to the video. Now we'll be listening to the biography of author H.P. Lovecraft according to Wikipedia. The article will be linked below. Remember to like, subscribe, and consider leaving a comment if you want more videos like this. Thanks for watching. Early life and family tragedies. Lovecraft was born in his family home on August 20, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island. He was the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susie, née Phillips, Lovecraft, who were both of English descent. Susie's family was of substantial means at the time of their marriage, as her father, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, was involved in business ventures. In April 1893, after a psychotic episode in a Chicago hotel, Winfield was committed to Butler Hospital in Providence. His medical records state that he was doing and saying strange things at times for a year before his commitment. The person who reported these symptoms is unknown. Winfield spent 5 years in Butler before dying in 1898. His death certificate listed the cause of death as general paresis, a term synonymous with late-stage syphilis. Throughout his life, Lovecraft maintained that his father fell into a paralytic state due to insomnia and overwork, and remained that way until his death. It is not known whether Lovecraft was simply kept ignorant of his father's illness, or whether his later statements were intentionally misleading. After his father's institutionalization, Lovecraft resided in the family home with his mother, his maternal aunts Lillian and Annie, and his maternal grandparents Whipple and Roby. According to family friends, Susie doted on the young Lovecraft excessively, pampering him and never letting him out of her sight. Lovecraft later recollected that his mother was permanently stricken with grief after his father's illness. Whipple became a father figure to Lovecraft in this time. Lovecraft later noted that his grandfather became the center of my entire universe. Whipple, who often traveled to manage his business, maintained correspondence by letter with the young Lovecraft who, by the age of 3, was already proficient at reading and writing. Whipple encouraged the young Lovecraft to have an appreciation of literature, especially classical literature and English poetry. In his old age, he helped raise the young H.P. Lovecraft and educated him not only in the classics, but also in original weird tales of winged horrors and deep, low moaning sounds, which he created for his grandchild's entertainment. The original sources of Phillips's weird tales are unidentified. Lovecraft himself guessed that they originated from Gothic novelists like Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Charles Maturin. It was during this period that Lovecraft was introduced to some of his earliest literary influences, such as the Rime of the Ancient Mariner illustrated by Gustave Doré, 1001 Nights, Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, and Ovid's Metamorphoses. While there is no indication that Lovecraft was particularly close to his grandmother, Roby, her death in 1896 had a profound effect on him. According to him, it sent his family into a gloom from which it never fully recovered. His mother and aunts wore black mourning dresses that terrified him. This was also the time when Lovecraft, approximately 5.5 years old, started having nightmares that later informed his fictional writings. Specifically, he began to have recurring nightmares of beings he referred to as night gaunts. He credited their appearance to the influence of Doré's illustrations, which would whirl me through space at a sickening rate of speed, the while fretting and impaling me with their detestable tridents. 30 years later, night gaunts appeared in Lovecraft's fiction. Lovecraft's earliest known literary works were written at the age of 7, and were poems restyling the Odyssey and other Greco-Roman mythological stories. Lovecraft later wrote that during his childhood he was fixated on the Greco-Roman pantheon, and briefly accepted them as genuine expressions of divinity, foregoing his Christian upbringing. He recalled, at 5 years old, being told Santa Claus did not exist and retorted by asking why God is not equally a myth. At the age of 8, he took a keen interest in the sciences, particularly astronomy and chemistry. He also examined the anatomical books that were held in the family library, which taught him the specifics of human reproduction that were not yet explained to him. As a result, he found that it virtually killed my interest in the subject. In 1902, according to Lovecraft's later correspondence, astronomy became a guiding influence on his worldview. He began publishing the periodical Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, using the hectograph printing method. Lovecraft went in and out of elementary school repeatedly, oftentimes with home tutors making up for the lost years, missing time due to health concerns that have not been determined. In their written recollections, his peers described him as withdrawn, but welcoming to those who shared his then-current fascination with astronomy, inviting them to look through his prized telescope. Education and financial decline. By 1900, Whipple's various business concerns were suffering a downturn, which resulted in the slow erosion of his family's wealth. He was forced to let his family's hired servants go, leaving Lovecraft, Whipple, and Susie, being the only unmarried sister, alone in the family home. In the spring of 1904, Whipple's largest business venture suffered a catastrophic failure. Within months, he died at age 70 due to a stroke. After Whipple's death, Susie was unable to financially support the upkeep of the expansive family home on what remained of the Phillips estate. Later that year, she was forced to move to a small duplex with her son. Lovecraft called this time one of the darkest of his life, remarking in a 1934 letter that he saw no point in living anymore. He considered the possibility of committing suicide. His scientific curiosity and desire to know more about the world prevented him from doing so. In fall 1904, he entered high school. Much like his earlier school years, Lovecraft was periodically removed from school for long periods for what he termed near breakdowns. He did say, though, that while having some conflicts with teachers, he enjoyed high school, becoming close with a small circle of friends. Lovecraft also performed well academically, excelling in particular at chemistry and physics. Aside from a pause in 1904, he also resumed publishing the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, as well as starting the Scientific Gazette, which dealt mostly with chemistry. It was also during this period that Lovecraft produced the first of the fictional works that he was later known for, namely, The Beast in the Cave and The Alchemist. It was in 1908, prior to what would have been his high school graduation, that Lovecraft suffered another unidentified health crisis, though this instance was more severe than his prior illnesses. The exact circumstances and causes remain unknown. The only direct records are Lovecraft's own correspondence, wherein he retrospectively described it variously as a nervous collapse and a sort of breakdown, in one letter blaming it on the stress of high school despite his enjoying it. In another letter concerning the events of 1908, he notes, "I was and am prey to intense headaches, insomnia, and general nervous weakness, which prevents my continuous application to anything." Although Lovecraft maintained that he was going to attend Brown University after high school, he never graduated and never attended school again. Whether Lovecraft suffered from a physical ailment, a mental one, or some combination thereof has never been determined. An account from a high school classmate described Lovecraft as exhibiting terrible tics, and that at times he'd be sitting in his seat, and he'd suddenly up and jump. Harry K. Brobst, a psychology professor, examined the account and claimed that chorea minor was the probable cause of Lovecraft's childhood symptoms, while noting that instances of chorea minor after adolescence are very rare. In his letters, Lovecraft acknowledged that he suffered from bouts of chorea as a child. Brobst further ventured that Lovecraft's 1908 breakdown was attributed to a hysteroid seizure, a term that has become synonymous with atypical depression. In another letter concerning the events of 1908, Lovecraft stated that he could hardly bear to see or speak to anyone, and liked to shut out the world by pulling down dark shades and using artificial light. Earliest recognition. Few of Lovecraft and Susie's activities between late 1908 and 1913 were recorded. Lovecraft described the steady continuation of their financial decline highlighted by his uncle's failed business that cost Susie a large portion of their already dwindling wealth. One of Susie's friends, Clara Hess, recalled a visit during which Susie spoke continuously about Lovecraft being so hideous that he hid from everyone and did not like to walk upon the streets where people could gaze on him. Despite Hess's protests to the contrary, Susie maintained this stance. For his part, Lovecraft said he found his mother to be a positive marvel of consideration. A next-door neighbor later pointed out that what others in the neighborhood often assumed were loud, nocturnal quarrels between mother and son were actually recitations of William Shakespeare, an activity that seemed to delight them both. During this period, Lovecraft revived his earlier scientific periodicals. He endeavored to commit himself to the study of organic chemistry, Susie buying the expensive glass chemistry assemblage he wanted. Lovecraft found his studies were stymied by the mathematics involved, which he found boring and caused headaches that incapacitated him for the remainder of the day. Lovecraft's first non-self-published poem appeared in a local newspaper in 1912. Called Providence in 2000 AD, it envisioned a future where Americans of English descent were displaced by Irish, Italian, Portuguese, and Jewish immigrants. In this period, he also wrote racist poetry, including New England Fallen and On the Creation of N-Words, but there is no indication that either were published during his lifetime. In 1911, Lovecraft's letters to editors began appearing in pulp and weird fiction magazines, most notably Argosy. A 1913 letter critical of Fred Jackson, one of Argosy's more prominent writers, started Lovecraft down a path that defined the remainder of his career as a writer. In the following letters, Lovecraft described Jackson's stories as being trivial, effeminate, and, in places, coarse. Continuing, Lovecraft argued that Jackson's characters exhibit the delicate passions and emotions proper to Negroes and anthropoid apes. This sparked a nearly year-long feud in the magazine's letters section between the two writers and their respective supporters. Lovecraft's most prominent opponent was John Russell, who often replied in verse, and to whom Lovecraft felt compelled to reply because he respected Russell's writing skills. The most immediate effect of this feud was the recognition garnered from Edward F. Dawes, then head editor of the United Amateur Press Association (UPA). Dawes invited Russell and Lovecraft to join the organization and both accepted. Lovecraft joined the UPA in April 1914. In 1921, Lovecraft said, "With the advent of United, I obtained a renewed will to live, a renewed sense of existence as other than a superfluous weight, and found a sphere in which I could feel that my efforts were not wholly futile. For the first time, I could imagine that my clumsy gropings after art were a little more than faint cries lost in the unlistening void." Rejuvenation and tragedy. Lovecraft immersed himself in the world of amateur journalism for most of the following decade. During this period, he advocated for amateurism's superiority to commercialism. Lovecraft defined commercialism as writing for what he considered lowbrow publications for pay. This was contrasted with his view of professional publication, which was what he called writing for what he considered respectable journals and publishers. He thought of amateur journalism as serving as practice for a professional career. Lovecraft was appointed chairman of the Department of Public Criticism of the UPA in late 1914. He used this position to advocate for what he saw as the superiority of archaic English language usage. Emblematic of the Anglophilic opinions he maintained throughout his life, he openly criticized other UPA contributors for their Americanisms and slang. Often, these criticisms were embedded in xenophobic and racist statements that the national language was being negatively changed by immigrants. In mid-1915, Lovecraft was elected vice president of the UPA. 2 years later, he was elected president and appointed other board members who mostly shared his belief in the superiority of British English over modern American English. Another significant event of this time was the beginning of World War I. Lovecraft published multiple criticisms of the American government and public's reluctance to join the war to protect England, which he viewed as America's ancestral homeland. In 1916, Lovecraft published his first short story, The Alchemist, in the Maine UPA Journal, which was a departure from his usual verse. Due to the encouragement of W. Paul Cook, another UPA member and future lifelong friend, Lovecraft began writing and publishing more prose fiction. Soon afterwards, he wrote The Tomb and Dagon. The Tomb, by Lovecraft's own admission, was greatly influenced by the style and structure of Edgar Allan Poe's works. Meanwhile, Dagon is considered Lovecraft's first work that displays the concepts and themes that his writings later became known for. Lovecraft published another short story, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, in 1919, which was his first science fiction story. Lovecraft's term as president of the UPA ended in 1918, and he returned to his former post as chairman of the Department of Public Criticism. In 1917, as Lovecraft related to Kleiner, Lovecraft made an aborted attempt to enlist in the United States Army. Though he passed the physical exam, he told Kleiner that his mother threatened to do anything, legal or otherwise, to prove that he was unfit for service. After his failed attempt to serve in World War I, he attempted to enroll in the Rhode Island Army National Guard, but his mother used her family connections to prevent it. During the winter of 1918 to 1919, Susie, exhibiting the symptoms of a nervous breakdown, went to live with her elder sister, Lillian. The nature of Susie's illness is unclear, as her medical papers were later destroyed in a fire at Butler Hospital. Winfield Townley Scott, who was able to read the papers before the fire, described Susie as having suffered a psychological collapse. Neighbor and friend Clara Hess, interviewed in 1948, recalled instances of Susie describing weird and fantastic creatures that rushed out from behind buildings and from corners at dark. In the same account, Hess described a time when they crossed paths in downtown Providence and Susie was unaware of where she was. In March 1919, she was committed to Butler Hospital, like her husband before her. Lovecraft's immediate reaction to Susie's commitment was visceral, writing to Kleiner that existence seems of little value, and that he wished it might terminate. During Susie's time at Butler, Lovecraft periodically visited her and walked the large grounds with her. Late 1919 saw Lovecraft become more outgoing. After a period of isolation, he began joining friends in trips to writer gatherings, the first being a talk in Boston presented by Lord Dunsany, whom Lovecraft had recently discovered and idolized. In early 1920, at an amateur writer convention, he met Frank Belknap Long, who ended up being Lovecraft's most influential and closest confidant for the remainder of his life. The influence of Dunsany is apparent in his 1919 output, which is part of what was later called Lovecraft's dream cycle, including The White Ship and The Doom That Came to Sarnath. In early 1920 he wrote The Cats of Ulthar and Celiphies, which were also strongly influenced by Dunsany. It was later in 1920 that Lovecraft began publishing the earliest Cthulhu mythos stories. The Cthulhu mythos, a term coined by later authors, encompasses Lovecraft's stories that share a commonality in the revelation of cosmic insignificance, initially realistic settings, and recurring entities and texts. The prose poem, Nyarlathotep, and the short story, The Crawling Chaos, in collaboration with Winifred Virginia Jackson, were written in late 1920. Following in early 1921 came The Nameless City, the first story that falls definitively within the Cthulhu mythos. In it is one of Lovecraft's most enduring phrases, a couplet recited by Abdul Alhazard. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. In the same year, he also wrote The Outsider, which has become one of Lovecraft's most heavily analyzed and differently interpreted stories. It has been variously interpreted as being autobiographical, an allegory of the psyche, a parody of the afterlife, a commentary on humanity's place in the universe, and a critique of progress. On May 24, 1921, Susie died in Butler Hospital due to complications from an operation on her gallbladder 5 days earlier. Lovecraft's initial reaction, expressed in a letter written 9 days after Susie's death, was a deep state of sadness that crippled him physically and emotionally. He again expressed a desire that his life might end. Lovecraft's later response was relief, as he became able to live independently from his mother. His physical health also began to improve, although he was unaware of the exact cause. Despite Lovecraft's reaction, he continued to attend amateur journalist conventions. Lovecraft met his future wife, Sonia Green, at one such convention in July. Marriage in New York. Lovecraft's aunts disapproved of his relationship with Sonia. Lovecraft and Green married on March 3, 1924, and relocated to her Brooklyn apartment at 259 Parkside Avenue. She thought he needed to leave Providence to flourish and was willing to support him financially. Green, who was married before, later said Lovecraft performed satisfactorily as a lover, but she had to take the initiative in all aspects of the relationship. She attributed Lovecraft's passive nature to a stultifying upbringing by his mother. Lovecraft's weight increased to 200 pounds, 91 kilograms, on his wife's home cooking. He was enthralled by New York City, and, in what was informally dubbed the Calum Club, he acquired a group of encouraging intellectual and literary friends who urged him to submit stories to Weird Tales. Its editor, Edwin Baird, accepted many of Lovecraft's stories for the ailing publication, including Under the Pyramids, which was ghostwritten for Harry Houdini. Established informally some years before Lovecraft arrived in New York, the Court Calum Club members were boys' adventure novelist Henry Everett McNeill, the lawyer and anarchist writer James Ferdinand Morton Jr., and the poet Reinhard Kleiner. On January 1, 1925, Sonia moved from Parkside to Cleveland in response to a job opportunity, and Lovecraft left for a small first-floor apartment on 169 Clinton Street, at the edge of Red Hook, a location which came to discomfort him greatly. Later that year, the Calum Club's 4 regular attendees were joined by Lovecraft along with his protege Frank Belknap Long, bookseller George Willard Kirk, and Samuel Loveman. Loveman was Jewish, but he and Lovecraft became close friends in spite of the latter's anti-Semitic attitudes. By the 1930s, writer and publisher Herman Charles Koenig was one of the last to become involved with the Calum Club. Not long after the marriage, Green lost her business and her assets disappeared in a bank failure. Lovecraft made efforts to support his wife through regular jobs, but his lack of previous work experience meant he lacked proven marketable skills. The publisher of Weird Tales was attempting to make the loss-making magazine profitable and offered the job of editor to Lovecraft, who declined, citing his reluctance to relocate to Chicago on aesthetic grounds. Baird was succeeded by Farnsworth Wright, whose writing Lovecraft criticized. Lovecraft's submissions were often rejected by Wright. This may have been partially due to censorship guidelines imposed in the aftermath of a Weird Tales story that hinted at necrophilia, although after Lovecraft's death, Wright accepted many of the stories he had originally rejected. Sonia also became ill and immediately after recovering, relocated to Cincinnati and then to Cleveland. Her employment required constant travel. Added to his feelings of failure in a city with a large immigrant population, Lovecraft's single-room apartment was burgled, leaving him with only the clothes he was wearing. In August 1925, he wrote, "A Horror at Red Hook," and "He." In the latter, the narrator says, "My coming to New York had been a mistake, for whereas I had looked for poignant wonder and inspiration, I had found instead only a sense of horror and oppression which threatened to master, paralyze, and annihilate me." This was an expression of his despair at being in New York. It was at around this time he wrote the outline for The Call of Cthulhu, with its theme of the insignificance of all humanity. During this time, Lovecraft wrote Supernatural Horror in Literature on the eponymous subject. It later became one of the most influential essays on supernatural horror. With a weekly allowance green cent, Lovecraft moved to a working-class area of Brooklyn Heights, where he resided in a tiny apartment. He lost approximately 40 pounds, 18 kilograms, of body weight by 1926, when he left for Providence. Return to Providence and death. Back in Providence, Lovecraft lived with his aunts in a spacious brown Victorian wooden house at 10 Barnes Street until 1933. He then moved to 66 Prospect Street, which became his final home. The period beginning after his return to Providence contains some of his most prominent works, including The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Call of Cthulhu, and The Shadow over Innsmouth. The former two stories are partially autobiographical, as scholars have argued that The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is about Lovecraft's return to Providence, and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward is, in part, about the city itself. The former story also represents a partial repudiation of Dunsany's influence, as Lovecraft decided that his style did not come to him naturally. At this time, he frequently revised work for other authors and did a large amount of ghostwriting, including The Mound, Winged Death, and The Diary of Alonzo Typer. Client Harry Houdini was laudatory, and attempted to help Lovecraft by introducing him to the head of a newspaper syndicate. Plans for a further project, a book titled The Cancer of Superstition, were ended by Houdini's death in 1926. After returning, he also began to engage in antiquarian travels across the eastern seaboard during the summer months. During the summer of 1930, Lovecraft visited, among other locations, New York City, Brattleboro, Vermont, Wilbraham, Massachusetts, Charleston, South Carolina, and Quebec City. Later, in August, Robert E. Howard wrote a letter to Weird Tales praising a then-recent reprint of Lovecraft's The Rats in the Walls, and discussing some of the Gaelic references used within. Its editor, Farnsworth Wright, forwarded the letter to Lovecraft, who responded positively to Howard, and soon the two writers were engaged in a vigorous correspondence that lasted for the rest of Howard's life. Howard quickly became a member of the Lovecraft Circle, a group of writers and friends all linked through Lovecraft's voluminous correspondence, as he introduced his many like-minded friends to one another and encouraged them to share their stories, utilize each other's fictional creations, and help each other succeed in the field of pulp fiction. Meanwhile, Lovecraft was increasingly producing work that brought him no remuneration. Affecting a calm indifference to the reception of his works, Lovecraft was in reality extremely sensitive to criticism and easily precipitated into withdrawal. He was known to give up trying to sell a story after it was rejected once. Sometimes, as with The Shadow over Innsmouth, he wrote a story that might have been commercially viable but did not try to sell it. Lovecraft even ignored interested publishers. He failed to reply when one inquired about any novel Lovecraft might have ready. Although he had completed such a work, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, it was never typed up. A few years after Lovecraft moved to Providence, he and his wife Sonia Green, having lived separately for so long, agreed to an amicable divorce. Green moved to California in 1933 and remarried in 1936, unaware that Lovecraft, despite his assurances to the contrary, never officially signed the final decree. As a result of the Great Depression, he shifted towards socialism, decrying both his prior political beliefs and the rising tide of fascism. He thought that socialism was a workable middle ground between what he saw as the destructive impulses of both the capitalists and the Marxists of his day. This was based in a general opposition to cultural upheaval, as well as support for an ordered society. Electorally, he supported Franklin D. Roosevelt, but he thought that the New Deal was not sufficiently leftist. Lovecraft's support for it was based in his view that no other set of reforms were possible at that time. In late 1936, he witnessed the publication of The Shadow over Innsmouth as a paperback book. 400 copies were printed, and the work was advertised in Weird Tales and several fan magazines. However, Lovecraft was displeased, as this book was riddled with errors that required extensive editing. It sold slowly, and only approximately 200 copies were bound. The remaining 200 copies were destroyed after the publisher went out of business 7 years later. By this point, Lovecraft's literary career was reaching its end. Shortly after having written his last original short story, The Haunter of the Dark, he stated that the hostile reception of At the Mountains of Madness had done more than anything to end my effective fictional career. His declining psychological and physical states made it impossible for him to continue writing fiction. On June 11th, Robert E. Howard was informed that his chronically ill mother would not awaken from her coma. He walked out to his car and died by suicide with a pistol that he had stored there. His mother died shortly thereafter. This deeply affected Lovecraft, who consoled Howard's father through correspondence. Almost immediately after hearing about Howard's death, Lovecraft wrote a brief memoir titled In Memoriam, Robert Irvin Howard, which he distributed to his correspondents. Meanwhile, Lovecraft's physical health was deteriorating. He was suffering from an affliction that he referred to as grippe. Due to his fear of doctors, Lovecraft was not examined until a month before his death and was diagnosed with terminal cancer of the small intestine. He was hospitalized in the Jane Brown Memorial Hospital and lived in constant pain until his death on March 15, 1937, in Providence. In accordance with his lifelong scientific curiosity, he kept a diary of his illness until he was physically incapable of holding a pen. After a small funeral, Lovecraft was buried in Swan Point Cemetery and was listed alongside his parents on the Phillips family monument. In 1977, fans erected a headstone in the same cemetery on which they inscribed his name, the dates of his birth and death, and the phrase, "I am Providence," a line from one of his personal letters. That was the biography of author H.P. Lovecraft according to Wikipedia. The article will be linked below. Remember to like, subscribe, and consider leaving a comment if you want more videos like this. Thank you very much for watching.